by thanking Ginny. Ginny, say hello. Ginny Tomania is, she works here at the gallery as well as in our art consulting firm, and she sort of eagerly volunteered to curate this show, which was fantastic. And she did an amazing, I think, very sensitive, very skillful job at putting the work together in a space, which is something she certainly worked with Jenn on. You did a fantastic job. It's a beautiful show. I also just so much appreciate the passion that you bring to representing artists, and to, she sort of jumps out of her skin of excitement to curate, so it's just fantastic. So thank you so much. And it's always such a joy for me to have Jenn exhibiting in our space. I actually didn't count up the shows, but she showed with us quite a bit, and I have so much admiration for you, Jenn, in terms of your artist practice is unbelievably unwavering, and I think this show is clearly a testament to that. The world threw things at you that were, many people, would have wanted to crawl under a rock and, not do anything, and instead you created all of this. It's pretty amazing, and we're so happy to have you here and have you healthy.
Yes.
I also think, in thinking about Jenn's work over the many years, many artists have this, but I don't know that any have it more than Jenn, and is a super strong inner compass. You just sort of know where you're going. You just know what your interests are, and they just keep leading you down the path. And it's not because you're getting, accolades or, any sort of criticism. You are just on this path, and it just keeps opening up for you. And it's really, I feel like that dedication is admirable in itself, and it's also really resulted in some extraordinary work. So I really appreciate that. And then personally, I think in general, I'm in this position, so I feel that art is a gift, and I feel like your work is certainly a gift in general, and a personal gift to me. A year ago, we had the fires in Napa. My house, luckily, wasn't under serious threat, but we're in that sort of like, you may have to evacuate time, and so it's just very unsettling. And my mom is on the phone like, you should be packing up. And I'm thinking, I don't know where to begin. Like, I just was like spinning around, like I'm just trying to deny it or whatever. But to be honest, the only one thing that I knew I wanted to keep for myself was your painting. So it was like this moment of clarity. Like, it really means something to me. So you're not painting in a void. Thank you. And speaking of not painting in a void, I think it's such a pleasure to have DeWitt Cheng here, and I'm so grateful that you are taking the time again to be with us, to lead an artist talk, and for the second time. DeWitt's been so generous in coming to the gallery often, writing many reviews about our shows, acting as a juror for a show that is coming up. Just a real anchor, I would say, for a connection for our gallery to sort of the broader world, the broader art world in the Bay Area. It's meant such a huge amount to us. And I now understand, which I didn't really at first, that you were very deliberately trying to kind of shine a light on the Oakland gallery scene, and show maybe the rest of the Bay Area and beyond that some serious things are happening here. And we were trying to do that all on our own, which was kind of a hard thing to achieve. And so you really helped really put us on the map, which I so appreciate. DeWitt was part of a really interesting discussion at Minnesota Street Project this week. I know some of you were there, which was interesting in many, many ways. But there were some things that I heard from you that really rung true and that I really appreciate. And one was that, sort of transcending your own personal taste, you really can relate to work with a sense of empathy and sympathy. And I think that is what it takes, it's like stepping in somebody else's shoes, stepping into somebody else's vision, and only by doing that can you really understand and appreciate whether it's something you would choose to have in your home or choose to look at all the time, but at least you have given it a chance to unfold in front of you in its in its fullness. And that the fact that you approach art with that attitude is fantastic, especially as a critic, which there are others that might be seen as people that fear what they're going to say, because they might be dismissed. And instead of doing that, you may not have all positive things to say, but at least you are entering into as much as you can their vision, which is fantastic. And all of this, it seems that you are founded in your interest in art history, and I'm so grateful that you see your job, or one of the aspects of your job is helping to place artists working today in the broader scope of art history. And I think I also share that interest, and what I'm doing, I hope, has done some of that. But again, I think it's this, we need galleries, we need the artists, and we need the writers who can really help kind of project that out. And hopefully it does enter into a larger discourse. So thank you so much for being here, and I appreciate, I'll look forward to the talk, in whichever way it goes.
I'm going to preface some of my remarks by explaining that there was a panel at the Minnesota Street Project with several other critics, writers, and it was the ostensible topic was writing in the digital age, although we sort of didn't get around it yet. It got to be a little bit more generalized. But my stance has always been as an art history nut and an artist for many years, that art is well, for me it was kind of the last frontier. It was the last not frontier, the last resort. It was kind of the one area that I thought was really free, an area of free thought. Now, whether that's true or not is another matter. But I like to present the creative art enterprise as a worthy project, and it's not just, again, producing things for the market. And Jenn is a prime example of the kind of artist that I like to support, because as Chandra said, she's got a strong internal compass, and you may not know where she's going to go. These things would have been unpredictable 4 years ago, but there's always an intent. There's an intelligence and a creative drive behind it. So that said, I want to, I interviewed her 2 days ago here for about an hour. So it got me a couple of questions, directions to investigate. But I'd like to start just by kind of setting the scene before we get to the new work for the paintings. And I'm going to quote briefly, I won't try to put you all to sleep, three reviews, 2 by me and 1 by my colleague Barbara Morris. And I'll go in reverse chronological order. First one is from May 2012, and it's Barbara Morris in Art Limited. We'll have a show here in maybe 2011 or early 2012, I'm not sure. But anyway, reflections on nature and domesticated nature in particular have been compelling subjects for artists such as Monet, who created his gardens at Giverny to provide subject matter for his paintings, up through Hockney, today returning to his English roots in works of the Yorkshire countryside. Artist Jenn Shifflet shares his fascination with the allure of flora, using a layered, mixed media technique to create glowing visions of ethereal, abstracted landscapes in verdant refuge nature. Shifflet uses an unusual process beginning with a layer of photographic information printed by Oakland's Magnolia editions on wooden panel. The artist then builds up her surfaces with acrylic and oil paint using layers of color and glaze, ending with seductive, glistening images that beckon us to bask in visual pleasure. Shifflet takes us down a verdant path, suggesting an eternal spring-like lushness, where the ambiguity between sky, water, and foliage leaves us unsure, even of our point of reference. Whatever season might exist in this mental landscape is a temperate one. Avoiding specifics, Shifflet, a Buddhist, feels, quote, the ineffable beauty of life is held within a profound fragility of impermanence. Okay, and then in May 2011, a year before, Jenn showed, three-person show at JFK University, an alma mater. Mm-hmm. Remember that? Of course you do. Okay, I prefaced it by kind of taking a little poke at the postmodernist idea that nothing is real or genuine. Not all artists take the art simulacra bait. Like Dr. Johnson kicking the stone to prove its existence, they find meaning in materials, imbuing matter with life. Some even see art making as a spiritual practice. Jenn Shifflet explores, quote, time, fleeting moments of perception, and reflections of the natural world, unquote. Her labor-intensive layered oils, like A Handful of Stardust for You, Sky Dream Reverie, In the Midst, Waves of Spring, Cluster of Moments, and Lightly Adrift, present watery landscapes afloat with stylized clouds and flowers, sparkling ripples, and bubbles of optical flare that could be located on the water, above or below it, or in the viewer's mind-eye complex. Shifflet hints at some eternal landscape attainable only through poetic reflection. And then the last one was a piece that I did in September 2009, Free Space Press. And I sort of introduced it by talking about the spiritual roots of abstraction 100 years ago, which are generally not considered much today. Post-war formalist art embraced symbolic flatness as eagerly as it banished perspective, space, narrative, and illusion. The realm of the sacred, mysterious, and metaphysical that preoccupied artists for millennia was declared an aesthetic, dead zone. Nature's creativity, rather than dead zones, is the subject of Jenn Shifflet's paintings. Marine fantasies that seem to derive from the biomorphic surrealists and related myth-minded souls. These small to medium-sized oils on panel provide intimate views into watery realms, traditionally symbolizing the unconscious, where hidden life stirs in curvilinear waves and currents, serpentine coils of smoke and cloud, jewel-like clusters of orbs, either real, bubbles, eggs, pearls, or optical, lens flares, reflections, after images, and linear strands of protoplasm or ectoplasm. Shifflet's works, which evolve through multiple layers of glazing, balancing accident and intuition, inhabit the old, abandoned symbolic realm. They synthesize opposites, being both, quote, ethereal and organic, poised between movement and stillness, emergence and dissolution. With their peeps into the depths through transparent layers and membranes, there are poetic paeans to the natural world with its cyclical time and eternal present. With their unconscious and immortal life forms, radially organized plants and anemones, they suggest the deep past, or perhaps alternatively, and I put in a little comment about human extinction, post-primate future. Okay, so thank you very much for your work, and it's, again, this is a sort of an introduction to your paintings of a few years ago. Let's just talk a little bit about how you became an artist.
Okay. So I started painting and drawing when I was about 11. My brother, who's 3 years older than me, was an artist, and he at that point was just starting to work with someone who later became my art teacher as well in high school. And I went to just a public high school, but because of this one teacher, Walter Bartman, he really made it an incredible art program. And I was saying earlier to someone how he pushed us really hard, and it was pretty much like you can't do anything else extracurricular besides painting. And he was a painter, and so he wanted us to paint a painting a week throughout the year, including the summers. And to, all summer I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C., and I would spend the summers with him painting plein air. And we'd be down on the mall in D.C. where all the museums are, and amongst all the tourists and everything with our easels set up. And we'd go like a week at a time to each different location. And so I from 9th grade through 12th grade, was like just heavy painting. And by the time I was in 12th grade, I think I had 4 periods of art a day. So I would have a few academics in the morning, and then the rest of the day was all painting. And he allowed us to go off of campus and go to different sites and do plein air painting. So my brother, really, before I started working with that teacher, my brother sat me down and he got me my first set of paints, and he taught me how to draw perspective, and he set up, the egg is the classic, to learn tone, and he'd set up these little still lifes for me and get me to draw. So he's been a really big influence on me artistically, and we've always had it. He was a painter, and then he became an architect, went to Cooper Union and full scholarship, and ended up doing some really incredible work architecturally. And although we have different aesthetics in some ways, there's a lot of overlaps too, and his interest in light in a space and how a space holds light. And so we have a lot aesthetically that we talk about, and he's been an important influence for me. But really having that awesome high school teacher that was so committed to art making totally set my path, because I was not the best academically, and I struggled with learning disabilities, and the academics were just not my strong point. And so to be able to be taught in a way that was so visually focused was perfect for me. And then I went on to my undergraduate was kind of a mix of Latin American studies with Spanish and a little bit of environmental studies, and then art, and how art can be used in terms of education with all of those issues. And I spent quite a bit of time in Latin America, and then came back to the States and did my MFA at JFK University in Arts and Consciousness Studies.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, that was the beginning.
How lucky you were to have such an amazing teacher. Now, was he sort of talent scouting, and he spotted you and your brother, or was he through everybody?
he was committed, a committed teacher, and he loved what he did, and he believed in in creating art so intensely. And he was always painting. So that's just something he imparted to us. And sometimes he got criticized for the intensity of which he worked us. But personally, I'm really grateful for it. I think that set a work ethic for me early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that I'm listed here not as a moderator, so I would like to. I don't think you're going to require moderation, but I would like to invite people to ask questions. If something comes up, just raise your hand. This is all free form, even though we quote rehearsed. So tell me about your experience at JFKU. Did that program with its somewhat unorthodox viewpoint of art as spirituality, not in getting into the market?
Right.
Was that the right place for you?
It wasn't the perfect place for me, but it was more the right place than a traditional art school would have been. I was kind of at a place in my life where my spiritual practice, my interest in Buddhism and in yoga, and my painting practice were, for some reason I felt like I had to choose one or the other somehow. And so I didn't really feel like I would do well at a traditional art school. And I was just kind of at a crossroads, and then I found the JFK program, and they really married the two together. And I actually started off in not the MFA program, but just the other graduate program that they had that was like transformative arts, but it wasn't really my thing. I really wanted to paint, and so I switched over to the MFA program. And I'd say what did work for me there was the encouragement to really take the time that you have in an MFA program to explore and experiment and not get set in any sort of style or specific body of work, and to do a lot of kind of free-form experimentation. And my work started moving from, since I came from such a kind of Western approach to learning art, and abstraction wasn't part of my vocabulary then, although looking back I see how my landscapes, still lifes, figures, everything was really about color and light. But it hadn't turned into abstraction yet. And so through the MFA program, actually started doing a whole body of work that kind of married a little bit of the abstraction with figures, and I was working from a whole pile of MRI films of my body, and they were very abstracted, biomorphic, kind of weird, otherworldly, slightly surrealistic self-portraits in a way, inner landscapes, and that kind of led to a transition towards less and less form being present through time. The paintings were kind of a way for me. I had actually gone through a major surgery in my mid-20s where I had to learn how to hold my head up from scratch because the surgery was really substantial on my neck. And I started using painting as almost like physical therapy, as a way to create more space and breath and movement in my body, and then kind of look at the work that I was creating and feel like it was just sort of intuitively the way that I was working, that I would see what I was doing in my piece and feel like, okay, there's too much form, there's too much tightness, there's not enough space, there's not enough breath. It was sort of like a mirror of what I was dealing with physically. And so I started to kind of carve out space in my paintings, and then my body's response would be to have more breath and more space. And so that's what led to the Color Field series. And so I think that my experience at JFK, there's one moment I think that really influenced me actually, was an assignment to go to the SF MoMA and find one piece of art and sit in front of it for an hour and do nothing else. And I chose a Yves Klein painting of his Blue, and it was just all solid blue. And the more time with it that I spent, the more the painting opened up to me and unfolded. And by the end of it, it was so musical to me. I have a little bit of association of colors with sound, and kind of like looking at light in a way that's like a harmonic. And so this piece was like a street circus, and it was like tambourines and like it was noisy by the end. And then the color had a sense that it expanded beyond the borders of the piece, and it expanded outwards. And I was just so taken by that experience that I really began to question how light, color, and space could have that kind of effect. And I think that was a big part of my time there.
Was this one of his International Klein Blue monochrome pieces?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And that amazing blue.
Yes.
As a sort of art history guy, I can't resist asking you, when you were in high school and college, kind of finding your way,
Yeah.
were there certain artists that resonated with you, other than your client, of course?
Definitely the Impressionists from like high school. It was all about the Impressionists for me, and Monet in particular. His studies of light are what most influenced me, probably. And then once I was in college, it started to be, actually, my undergraduate, I did a lot of mural work, public mural projects. My partner, Katie, and I actually met that way, doing a mural group, and we did probably, 8 to 10 murals around Olympia, Washington. So you had asked me the other day about my experience in Latin America and whether that came into my work at all, and I think back then that it did. Studying the murals of Latin America was definitely a part of it. So wait, what was the question again?
I was just curious. I wasn't asking you directly, but I was just wondering, because you were talking about your MRI scans as the figure gradually kind of subsuming into the landscape.
Yeah.
I think about certain Bay Area painters, Oliveira and Bischoff, as figures in landscapes, and there's a sort of metaphysical or dreamy content to some of them.
I think, once I was in college and working on my MFA, it became more about like Rothko and light and space artists and color field artists. I think the influence of the Impressionists early on is, kind of led into that.
So the figure per se has never been a major part. It's more about the light and space, and the viewer. The viewer's not in the canvas. The viewer is on the floor looking at the painting. Which brings us to this new work, which again, when I read about these other pieces, there were sort of these arenas where things slowly evolved and glimmered in the color mists. I thought of Baziodes and Moreau and people like that, which are not your influences. But now these works are more iconic and symmetrical. The paintings, and then the glass works are, they are that too. They become almost like icons. So again, you're sort of you're taking the viewer out of the painting, and the viewer is now the observer. So tell us about the evolution of the glass pieces from your oil and acrylic pieces.
There's a lot in there. So the painting, I basically about 3.5 years ago or so started getting frustrated with only being able to allude to light and work with it symbolically, but not actually directly play with light. And given that color and light and space have been the main elements that really interested me from early on, and with the Impressionists being artists that kind of deconstruct objects and basically have it just be about light and color in a way that the forms become less important. So the paintings, I started to play around with things like painting on plexiglass, painting on aluminum, painting on layers of silk, multiple layers of silk, tried encaustic. I really wanted to work more directly with light, and I just couldn't. Everything I tried, it was over a period of several years of just feeling like it needed to go somewhere, and I wasn't sure where. I just knew that I wanted to be able to work with light more directly. And in the research that I was doing, I kind of stumbled upon what people were doing with kiln-formed glass, and I had no exposure to it before. I knew about blown glass and stained glass, but I really didn't know about kiln-formed glass. And lo and behold, Bullseye Glass, one of the main artisan producers of glass in this country, shop and a gallery space right here in Emeryville. And in my research, I found that they had an artist in residence program. And so I started taking classes with them with master kiln formers that would come to town in order to learn the basics. And then once I had the basics down, I applied for the residency and was fortunate enough to get it. And they are really excited about artists that work in a medium other than glass and can come without all the pre-knowledge of how glass works and try to create work in glass without knowing so much what it can and can't do, so you push the medium. And so I did a 3-month residency there where I was there every day. Like if I could have slept there, I would have. Like I was just so excited. When I first learned about kiln forming class, I was like, oh crap! I have to learn an entire new medium after being a painter for so many years. It's all I've really ever known, and so the amount of time it takes to learn a new practice is substantial. And so the residency, they really guided me through a lot of the technical stuff. There's a ton of physics involved in glass, and I really didn't know what I was fully stepping into. But I had this like pull to do it, and I knew I had to do it. And so I had sort of visions of where the work would go, but I didn't know how to do it quite yet. So really the first 2.5 years of working in glass was experimentation, and
were you still painting at the set all the
yeah,
time too?
yeah. I lightened up on the painting because I was so smitten with the glass that I wasn't painting as much, and it kind of scared me because I thought, what if I don't want to paint anymore? And I was just so in love with the glass and the potentials of working with it, and but I found that the painting allows me to work in ways that are more spontaneous than the glass. The glass requires a lot of forethought, and not that there isn't room for spontaneity and to have it go a totally different direction than I think. There's less so than there is with the painting. And the painting is more immediate and direct, and there's something so satisfying about that. So I did continue, but they started to have a dialogue between the two mediums, and painting became kind of a place to work out color issues, to work on color theory. I really wanted to understand color better, and then the glass gave me the place to work with the light directly. So yeah, that's kind of how the glass started.
And so describe for us the fabrication process, starting with, I guess you start with shards of glass,
Right.
which are just fragments of glass left over from ruined projects or something?
No, I get the glass. All my glass comes from Bullseye. When you're working in glass, you got to work with glass that's compatible with each other, with itself. So I pretty much just work with Bullseye glass. And I buy 5-pound jars of shards of glass in different colors. So it's fresh from the factory. It's not.
What is a shard? What's a shard?
So like, let's say I take this glass and I take a hammer and just pound the crap out of it until it's all little tiny pieces. That's it. So you can get. They come in different sizes of shards, from little itty bitty, teensy tiny that's hard to even pick up, to shards that are kind of more chunky, like that size.
Okay, so
yeah.
Bully on cue.
Yeah. So I'm starting with pretty tiny. I mean, the shards are about the same size as each bead is.
Okay.
They're just in a different shape before I turn them into beads. So the way that I do that is I have a flat kiln shelf, and I spread all the little shards of glass on the kiln shelf. I have to make sure that they're not touching each other. If they touch each other, they glom together and they make these weird sort of biomorphic shapes, which I save because it could be interesting to make a piece out of all those. And also it can be recast. But what I'm going for is a perfectly rounded little bead. And so if they're not touching, then what they do is when I bring them up to 1500 degrees, they bead up. And because glass wants to be, I think it's 6 millimeters thick. Like when it's heated, that's what it wants to be at.
What speed?
It's 6 millimeters.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So if it's at a smaller amount or a larger amount, it's either going to spread out or it's going to pull in. And so at that tiny size, they pull in and they bead up, and they have a flat back because they're sitting on a kiln shelf. So once I've got all of the beads, it takes about 8 to 10 firings to make all the beads for one piece. And it's about 5 pounds of shards of glass.
And the kiln shelf you're talking about is this size, right?
Yeah, it's about 2 inches larger than these. These are 22 by 22, and my kiln shelf is 24 by 24.
Okay. So you're basically putting out a little like a little baking pan full of little pieces of glass,
Kind of.
spaced out.
Yeah.
And you heat it up.
Yeah.
And it's 8 times.
Yeah.
Get enough for
Yeah.
one of these.
Yeah. And then I take screens and I filter them by size. So the larger ones and then to the little tiny ones, I separate them into about 3 or 4 different sizes. And then I lay a clear, usually clear sheet of glass if I want it to be fully transparent piece, which most of these are, except for a couple. And I lay that flat on the kiln shelf with what's called dams to hold in the glass. And I start to kind of pour in the colors. And so when they're poured in like that, though, the rounded part is either, half of it is up and then half of it is showing the flat side. And what I want you to see is just the rounded part, because when the light hits it, it refracts off of it. So if the flat parts are facing forward, it's sort of like a little bit of a dead zone. And so I then sit and I use tweezers and glasses from the CVS. And I just flip and then turn, and they're all sitting on each other. There's a few layers of beads of glass. So you flip one, and the other kind of goes like this, and I flip that, and the other, it's like this process so that they're all touching each other and influencing each other. But I just keep flipping, and I think it's probably somewhere around 10 hours of, over a few days. A few hours each day is about as much as I can handle of that type of work, looking down with my neck problems.
Yeah.
But it's a slow kind of meditative process. And then once I've got them all set, I ask Katie to help me, and we lift the kiln shelf and very, very, very slowly move it from my table to my kiln. Holding our breath and make sure the dogs are inside and there's nothing to trip over. And just very gently set it in. Take a deep breath, close the kiln, and then let it run. And it's about a 36-hour cycle.
How hot is it?
I bring it up to about 1360 for about 7 minutes or so. So really, with glass, you have to be very careful, especially when you've got all this uneven surfaces and thick and thin surfaces. It's really easy for it to crack in the heat. So it either cracks on the way up or it cracks on the way down in the kind of mid-heat range. And so you gotta go incredibly slow, going up and going down. And then there's areas where there can be problems, DeWitt, like little sort of pits and weird things that can happen in certain temperature ranges. And so it's all scheduled into the kiln. And I have like my work at Bullseye was really all about coming up with kiln schedules for all the different like parts of the process.
Now you said earlier that because you buy all your glass from Bullseye because it's important that glasses be compatible with each other. Are there different formulas for glass and this kind won't stick to that kind?
Yeah. I'm not so sure that it's about sticking to each other. I'm not an expert in this. I just know Each class has different formulas, and there's different elements in there. For example, the greens and the blues have more copper in them. The pinks and the reds have gold in them. And so there's many colors that when you put them together, they actually have a chemical reaction and create a third color, which is usually kind of a brown or rust kind of color. So you have to be careful what colors you're putting next to each other, but then you also have to be careful if you've got two different companies of glass that might not be heat, they might not react the same way at the same heat level.
Right.
So it's easier to just make it all compatible.
You said you buy these 5-pound jars of glass. Now, are they sorted by color?
Yes.
And so, but you're also, yeah, and you make your own, but I presume that you're doing all sort of one color batch at a time?
Yeah,
Otherwise
just for
you're
efficiency.
gonna go crazy, right?
Yes.
Sorting them out. But you do sort them by size.
Yes.
You use a sieve to do that.
Yeah. I used
Talk
to
about a dedicated artist.
for whatever reason, I like tediousness. I used to be a jeweler, and it was the same thing with silversmithing and goldsmithing. I was kind of obsessive about small details. I like the meditative and repetitive, sort of rhythmic practice that it is. It's a kind of contemplative in and of itself.
Did you feel that way about your paintings too? I mean, was there a sort of meditative aspect to those?
Yeah.
Because painting can be, as you said, spontaneous, but you can also approach it in a very methodical way.
Yeah, I think more because of the paintings have so many layers to them that it's a slow process, and in that sense, it kind of becomes a little bit meditative, and certainly with the imagery alluding to that kind of meditative practice. But other than that, not as much. I mean, it can be very repetitive, but not in the same way.
Yeah. Well, this is definitely you're investing. What did you say? 10, 12 hours to arrange these.
Yeah. And you can't really space out with glass. You know, glass it cuts you. I get cut all the time. So you have to pay attention. You really kind of have to be pretty present with it.
Yes. Let me ask you, you're putting these in your kiln for 36 hours, and you've figured out the timing and temperatures. If you overcook them, would it all melt into sort of a plasma, not plasma, but like a medieval window?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did a piece, and that's the other thing, is every kiln is a little bit different.
Yeah.
And so when I was at Bullseye, I chose out of their, 8 kilns or so, I chose one that I always worked with, because I got it down to exactly how many minutes it needed to be at that exact temperature. So if I then switch to another kiln that's like 5 degrees off, I did a piece that I put a lot of work into like these, and they all just like half melted.
Your souffle collapsed.
Oh, it was like really, it was like really gross looking. It just had a totally different feel to it. So I figured it out to the minute, to how to keep the exact amount of form, roundedness, without it losing that and just melting. But if I went really hot, it would become like a totally fused cast flat piece eventually.
And you still work at Bullseye? Or do you?
No, I just did the 3-month residency, and then I stay in touch.
Kiln, and you have figured out the timing temperature.
Yeah. So I have a baby kiln for testing, because every color also melts at a different temperature, slightly. So you have to test everything first. So I have a baby kiln for that. I have a mid-sized kiln for making all the beads, because it has 3 shelves. And then I have a big kiln for doing the flat, larger panels.
Well, I just have to say something about, the way that they're placed here on the wall with about 1/4 of an inch or so of space, which lets the light come through the back. I know that installing a piece like that is not easy, and props to the patient and careful people who manage that feat. So some of these, the color comes from the glass, and some of them you're actually painting on the back.
Right.
Sometimes you're doing something on the front, like the graphite piece in there.
Right. So I'm working with different colored glasses, and then when I first started, I was trying to do it all in glass, and I was using powdered glass sifted through a screen, so like a screen print. And I couldn't get the perfect gradations and as much control as I wanted. And sometimes you put things in the kiln, you're not sure how they're going to come out. So I ended up eventually realizing I can work with paint. And as a painter, it's, duh. So I started, a couple years ago, I went to Japan with my dad and my brother, and I went to a store called Pigment, which is like a dream for any painter. They just have a whole huge wall of pigments from around the world, and I made my dad and brother wait for like 3 hours while I narrowed down my choices, and I came home with quite a few iridescent pigments, and so I'm mixing the powders in with an oil-based resin, Galkid, and it adheres to the glass really beautifully. And the glass, the back side of the glass, since it's fired on a kiln shelf that is prepped with kind of like what would be a gesso, but for a kiln shelf, it has a little bit of brush marks, it has a little bit of texture, so the paint adheres really beautifully. So in the area, there's just areas of most of the pieces that where I'm accentuating the colors that are already in the glass, or I'm trying to bring out like a complementary color. Like, let's see, the piece in the middle back there, that's kind of it's called rhubarb is the color of the glass, but that's a glass that it's actually what's called a shift color. And so in one light, it's that color. And if you put it in, I think it's incandescent light, I'm not sure exactly, it turns like a chartreuse green. It literally, the glass itself changes color. And it's pretty dramatic. I have pictures where it's like, that's the same piece. I love things like that. And that question your perception and your sense of what is real. And what you see is not necessarily the full picture. And so painting on the back of that one, that piece goes from tiny little glass beads to thicker ones, because I was working in gradients, and so the color gets more saturated as it gets lower in the piece because of the thickness of the glass. But then, because that piece changes to its complementary color in different light, I played with that sort of concept. On the back of that piece, there's iridescent green and there's iridescent pinks, and so you get some of each, and they're working together. So I like to pull out what's kind of inherent in the glass itself and the qualities of the glass, and that's also why I went as simple as I did with the glass, because I really want to work with the material is what inspired me. So I let that kind of guide the way to working with it.
I'm just curious, would ceramic pigments work with glass, or would that not? I mean, a different melting point? Anything?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Probably not, but I really don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, stick with your glass pigments, and that's safe, because you know it's going to work.
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions at this point? Yes.
I'm wondering if you've ever used the little tiny glass beads in the paint. Have you ever ordered
Yeah. I actually have been experimenting quite a bit with like micro beads that are used in like construction and on roadways as the reflective the little itty bitty tiny clear beads, and doing paintings that kind of look like the glass pieces, and then sifting through screen over top with like laying down a medium that's like the gal kid, kind of a heavy-bodied resinous medium, and sifting the beads over top and letting it dry, and then like tilting it on its side so the rest fall off, and it just leaves one layer of glass beads. So it kind of has a similar feel to the glass pieces. So I'm playing around with that. I've experimented with the medium that already has glass beads in it, and it's just not, it's too thick for me.
Too thick?
Yeah.
I couldn't figure it out. Like one time I showed with Mary Corse, who uses them, and you could walk by those paintings and you'd get rainbows coming off of them, and I tried so hard to get that effect and I couldn't do it. So I was going to ask you, will you show me how to do it?
I'm not sure how she's getting rainbows, but
I couldn't figure it out. So I was curious if you had tried that.
Yeah, they're fun, definitely.
I have a question. Do you, for the glass work, do you do a piece before, like either in sketching or painting, before you actually lay it in glass? Is there a prep to that, or you do it as you go?
Both the paintings and the drawings, I don't do prep work. The paintings, because I tend to have an image that comes to my mind that I start with, and usually it ends up being something completely different. So I like that process of letting it just, whatever happens, and I try to get out of the way and let it happen. The glass actually tends to come to me almost as a finished piece. I see it in my mind. The kind of the inspiration for the glass pieces was my walks at dusk. I actually went through cancer in this past year, and all the work was created right after going through treatment and through recovery. And the show opened on the day of my 1-year cancer-free mark. And so during that process of recovery, I took these walks every day because my doctors were like, you need to keep moving. And so despite exhaustion from treatment, I would do these walks and take in the sky and like segments of the sky. And the BART is where I walk along the BART path. The BART is up here, and then you can see patches of sky and patches above. And I walked slow and just took in sort of these moments of just space and color and light. And then in the evening, when as I fall asleep, is when they tend to just appear almost finished, and I get up like over and over again and just jot down what I saw, and I might work with that image, and it evolves as I'm working on the piece, but it tends to be somewhat similar to what I see in my mind. And so that it's more of a matter of like, I see it and I have to figure out how to make it after.
Would you say that what you see in your mind, I mean, so it comes to you as a finished vision, is that, I mean, how related is that to what you've seen, the glimpse between the BART tracks? Or is it a kind of, I mean, are you taking sort of a color shift? Or
sometimes, some of them are, I would say are directly influenced. Most, I would say, are more influenced by like the subtlety of the gradient and where two different colors meet. I'm interested in that meeting place and sort of the color relations, the color theory that comes as when those two colors start blending. So, in the sky, that could be two different colors, and it's kind of abstracted from that, not totally direct.
Oh, a couple of days ago, I asked you if you had an interest in meteorological phenomena, auroras and things like that.
Yeah.
And you said yes, but not in a literal sense. And you were very interested in sort of transient, ephemeral beauty
Exactly.
that appears in life and, of course, in the sky.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's that transition space and the momentariness that interests me, and something that's super fleeting, beautiful and gone the next moment, that inspires me most.
Sounds very Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
You have any anything in Japan? Well, I mean, you did mention that you were a Buddhist, and I don't want to go into that too deeply, but and you had been interested in yoga before that.
Yeah.
So is that Maitreya Buddhist? Is that correct?
Mahayana Buddhism.
Mahayana.
So
Okay.
Vajrayana within Mahayana Buddhism,
Okay.
Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, I got the wrong one.
But that's definitely, I've had an interest and a practice for probably 20-something years, kind of off and on in depth, depending on what's going on in my life. But that's had a really profound influence, I think, on who I am as a person, how I see the world, and I don't intentionally set to create work that's about that, but I can't separate it out from who I am and how I see things, and how that practice has influenced my life. So it shows up, but it's not so much that I'm trying to say something specific or reference something specific. It just appears in the work because it's part of me.
The Buddhist appreciation for change,
Yeah.
and of course serenity, and so because I got the name of the Buddhism wrong, I can't kid you with L. Ron Hubbard claiming to be a Maitreya.
Claiming to be what?
The Maitreya.
Oh.
The
No.
fifth Buddha.
Oh no. No. Please no.
Okay.
James spoke earlier about coming to a place where you felt like you needed or wanted to learn more about color. How did you approach that? Was it because these are so intuitive in appearance? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think again it's that meeting place between two colors that really interested me, like how, I think because when two colors meet, and especially if they're complementary, they're being opposites but then coming together, and both existing in the same color that's made by the two. I think it's just kind of not theoretical, like maybe a philosophical thing that interests me, as well as a color theory thing. And for years I avoided black and I avoided browns and I avoided grays. So I feel like I wanted to understand color deeper and on a not so I don't know how to word it other than just to understand color deeper, including those colors and sort of the more of a range of neutrals with the intensity of color. I think the two together become a lot more interesting than like primary color or secondary color or tertiary color on its own. It's more to think about and more to learn. So that's part of what I set out to do, especially working with the glass pieces.
Does pointless theory interest you much?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that's definitely been part of my influence, how the pointillist worked with complementary colors right next to each other on such a tiny scale, but then that does something optically with your eyes. So yeah, definitely. These feel very in that vein.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dab.
Yeah. Exactly.
You're there with the goggles and tweezers instead.
Well, in the paintings too, like the color that you see in the paintings is not a color that's put on the surface. It's the color that's created through multiple transparent layers. So it's actually created in the piece rather than created in my palette. So in that same way related to pointillism, how one color influences the other when they're in a relationship close to each other.
Right, so you're seeing through layers
Yeah.
rather than
Next to each other.
juxtaposed to each
Right.
other.
But there's a lot of like complementary, I go back and forth and kind of like I'll put a whole layer of a transparent complementary color on top, like so that purplish one in the corner has layers of yellow transparent, which you can kind of see in it. And then I'll wipe away areas, so you get the two colors working together, whether you are really aware that it's there or not.
Any other questions?
I don't know if you've shown the glass enough to have this experience, but I wonder if you've been talking with anybody who's had their own very long history working with glass, and then how they respond to you being sort of new to the medium, and then maybe conversely, if you have sort of painter peers who you talk to and then you say now you're doing glass, and like how do they respond? Like is there any tension there?
I did find in the glass community that there was kind of a purity of material, sort of restricted mindset. And I think that's why at first I felt this pressure to do it all in glass and have no paint present in it, and to just do it with the powdered glass, until I realized, like, I'm a painter and I'm an artist, I break rules. Like, why? I'm gay, for God's sake. Like, why am I putting myself in a box? Like, it's never really been who I am. So, yeah. But not so, I didn't hit resistance in terms of painters having issue with me working in glass.
What you said earlier about the folks at the glass place.
Yeah.
Wanting to work with people who weren't pure glass people.
Yeah.
Because you know, the more of a purist you are, the more hidebound you become, traditional. I mean, it's exactly like, again, the whole idea of painters who take up printmaking. And it's like, oh, you're an intruder, you're an outsider, you're debasing the form. So, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for bringing in a different sensibility, and again, not knowing what you can't do, which is of course what Picasso was doing when he was doing prints. He didn't know what you could not do.
I find it really interesting, artists who are come from a different background, a different medium, and then come to glass and maybe meld ceramics or concrete or wood or different materials in with the glass. I think that's some of the most interesting contemporary glass work being done, personally. But that's just my interest.
Any more questions?
I'm curious on the process, the intense process of turning each piece of glass over, and now the way you described it, you're walking together to put it in the kiln. So now, while you're taking it over, you notice that there's a little imperfection. Is that just what's the tolerance? Just personal. Is it like that's it? It's over, or is imperfection? Where is it okay?
I then set it on my kiln shelf and I go grab my tweezers. So, and actually kind of killed my kiln by leaving a pair of tweezers in when I fired it. So I'm dealing with a dead kiln right now that I'm trying to resurrect. But I mean, if you look at the pieces, you will find little beads that have the back forward.
Okay.
You'll find some. You have to kind of look. So I'd say I'm fairly obsessive, but not like over the top.
I'm just curious. Yeah.
It's like the cigarette butts in a Jackson Pollock.
Right. That's true.
Or the leaves in a monk.
Right.
Anybody else?
So, you were talking about like when the heat goes wrong and so something unexpected happens. Has that been the basis for like an ongoing piece, or like do you try to screw with that thing to make it like?
Yeah.
good again, or like, because I know in painting, right, like you can sort of go back and forth, and there's a lot of stuff that you can do that won't be seen by the viewer. And so like for glass, like is there some wiggle room, or are there some pieces that are meaningful for you that were, quote unquote failures?
Totally. Well, for one, you can recast glass.
Mm-hmm.
So I do save like the sort of extra bits, to reuse. But I also have two pieces in this show that are examples of pieces that totally did not work out for me in terms of color. And I was basically gonna like melt them down completely and see what I was left with, or break it up or something. But I ended up taking a bottle of black spray paint, and I painted the whole thing, and it was this really intense matte black that like completely absorbed light, and it was so intense, and I loved it. And that's the back in the back room, that black piece. And then I came in with graphite over top to bring in some of this sort of shimmery light. So that's one example of a piece that like gone wrong that became resurrected, and I loved, the experimentation where it led. There's another piece in the back room that is also all painted on the surface and has some one of those colors that kind of shifts that as you look at it in different ways. And it was the same sort of, a mess up that became something really interesting to me. So yeah, definitely. So much of learning glass was about making mistakes.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you always just fire them one time?
Yes. To make all the beads, like I said, individually. But then the panel itself coming together one time. Yeah.
Have you ever experimented with multiple firings to see like what happens when you like build up and then the lower pieces melt a little bit more?
I haven't yet, but I have a few pieces that were mess ups that I want to do that with. Yeah. Just to
I think that'd be
learn.
really interesting, because then you have like more defined beads on top and less defined fruit balls on the bottom.
Because you think that it would melt, the bottom would melt more than the top?
It
or?
will, yeah, because the heat work is cumulative.
Right.
So yeah, like when you've seen some of my work, I fire it like 12 times.
Yeah.
So some of the fruit balls end up almost pushing completely into the surface, and then they stay on top.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting what happens.
Yeah, I have some experiments going where I do do a full fuse of sheet with the fruit balls, and so the fruit balls become melded flat into it, and so you get these little round dots of color.
Yeah.
So
I think it'd be
that's
interesting
it.
though, because then your fruit balls, some of them will like fall into the negative spaces.
Yeah.
Try it.
I wish I had a camera in my kiln and could see, at what point it does what.
And it depends on the color.
Yeah, exactly.
And frit is the name for the shards?
Shards of glass, yeah.
Ah, special terminology.
Yeah.
Frit ball.
Yeah. Yeah.
Jen, have you played with light in other directions on the work?
Well, yeah, so in my studio I have skylights, and I noticed having these up on the wall over the last year that the time of day really changes the piece kind of dramatically, and depending on how the natural light hits it, it lights up different areas, and it really, if it catches sort of the midsection of a piece or where there's iridescent pigment on the back, it's just like all of a sudden it's like light on water, and it's right at dusk that it happens. I'm a late morning person, not an early morning person at all, so I don't see it at that time of day, but at dusk it's like they really start to shimmer. So.
It's a great additional experiment with light that you get to play with as well.
And I like natural light more than I do electronic light, but I do want to do some experimenting. I mean, they're very much so affected by how the light is shining on them, but and light transmits through the piece. But very minimal and unseen source of light behind it that was very subtle. Like I was telling DeWitt the other day that in my mind I have this piece that would kind of come on like right as the sun's starting to set and just come on so slowly you don't even really notice it, but then it's kind of glowing a little bit, and then as the night, you know, as the moon rises and the sun is setting, it would kind of go off or last just for a little while and then go off, but it'd be really subtle. So I would like to play with that. I don't yet have the skills to do it. I don't know how.
That sounds fun.
Yeah.
You know about the Rothko murals at Harvard that were so faded that they restored them by actually projecting it onto the
Really?
faded paintings and therefore brought them back to life again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just was thinking, probably because of where we're sitting, the imagery that we're looking at, it struck me that this show feels very celestial compared. And when you were going back in history with Jenn's earlier work, it definitely always felt connected to the earth, or below water, or horizon lines, maybe the sky with some clouds, but definitely of the earth landscape. Is that conscious, or do you think that's true?
Yeah, one thing that I've avoided is the horizon itself, because I don't want it to become so pinpointed in landscape, but I do want it to have a sense of earth, of sky, of water, more elements. And glass is amazing that way because it is so alchemical and it is made of earth and you know, materials all found in the earth. So that's kind of inherent in the material. And in terms of the paintings, like they've gone from being formless to then kind of biomorphic, botanical abstraction to coming back now to formlessness. And partly that was because the glass was heading in that direction, and the two mediums were talking to each other. And partly I think because of what I went through with the cancer being the same year as this administration came into power, and you know, dealing with the angst of that I needed a lot of like quiet and a place to rest my mind. And so the simplicity of the work, the work getting to be more about color, light, and space without the extras, gave my mind a place to rest that has been much needed. So I think they became more internal for this particular body of work. I tend to create what I need, and it's always sort of the hope that it's maybe what somebody else needs or what somebody else relates to in some way, but it's definitely what I need. And I feel like the paintings kind of, rather than being populated by circles of light, I kind of zoomed in almost to like one circle, and then the glass work is almost like the opposite, zooming so far out that they almost become kind of cosmological, because there's such a multiplicity of all the little beads. So it's kind of like micro and macro between the two mediums, and one zoomed way out, one zoomed way in, and so that's how I kind of see them relating to each other. And I don't know if that answered your question. Okay.
Speaking of micro macro, I saw the Edward Bertinsky photo show yesterday at Robert McCoke Gallery, and I mean those photographs are amazing. I don't know how their landscapes seen from way up high with extremely high resolution camera. I don't know if it's military grade or what, but he'll have a scene of a landscape and it's maybe a few miles across. I mean, they're 5 feet photographs, and then you can see a truck that big. They're incredible.
So cool.
Yeah.
I love that feeling of, you know, when you're way out in the wilderness. I've done a lot of backpacking in California years ago. But I love more than anything that feeling of the vastness, and then to feel so tiny
Yes.
in the midst of that is I think, a lot of freedom in that.
Yes. Any questions? I'm really interested to see where you go once you decide enough of this, tweezer work. What new material stimulates you to kind of go somewhere else? And so I'm sort of hoping that the paint manufacturers and the nano fabricators come up with something that will really get you going. Something we have never seen before.
I know mirrors are showing up, so that's about all I know.
Okay.
Yeah, and more space.
Uh-huh.
So glass and glass with space in between rather than a solid panel.
Okay. Wow. More carrying things down to the kiln. Kind of ritual.
Yes.
Anyone else have any questions? Well, I think we've done a good job.